Well, good day, everyone, and thanks so much for joining the Asia Society for our panel today on Asian economic and trade trends and challenges in the wake of COVID. 2022 was supposed to be the year of economic recovery as economies around the world and in the region emerged from COVID. But it's not playing out this way. We are witnessing a number of developments which are potentially troublesome. Number one, rising energy and food and commodity prices as a result of the Russia-Ukraine war. Second, COVID lockdowns in major Chinese cities. I'm sure the topic we'll be talking about today. Three, resulting supply chain disruptions. And four, debt and inflation challenges are complicating efforts to boost GDP growth and increase trade, with different economies bouncing back at different speeds. These pressures have led the IMF to lower its global growth forecast for this year from 4.4% in January to 3.6% just last week. And at the same time, the World Trade Organization has lowered its trade forecast for this year from 4.7% to 3% in merchandise trade by volume. So what do these challenges mean for Asian economic recovery and for a region that depends so heavily on trade as a driver for economic growth? We have a great group of experts with us today to help us sort through these questions. First, let me introduce Dr. Albert Park. He currently serves as a chief economist of the Asian Development Bank, and he's currently on leave from his role as chair professor of economics at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. He has taught and consulted for the World Bank and other major international institutions and has extensive expertise in China's economic development. Second, we're thrilled to invite Ambassador Ted Osius to our stage. He is now president and CEO of the U.S. ASEAN Business Council, but is known for his long distinguished career as a U.S. diplomat for over 30 years, serving throughout Southeast Asia, including as the U.S. ambassador to Vietnam from 2014 to 2017, when I had the honor of working with him. He is the author of a very new book, something I recommend everyone get a copy of, called Nothing is Impossible, America's Reconciliation with Vietnam. Welcome, Ted. And finally, Dr. Shujiro Urata. It's a pleasure to invite you as well to join us. Dr. Urata is a professor emeritus at Waseda University and senior research advisor at the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. He has held positions at Brookings and the World Bank and is a real expert on trade and economic developments in Asia. So with this, we're just going to go right into a moderated discussion. I will be asking the questions in the beginning, but I really welcome questions from the audience. And so if you have questions you would like to put forward, please put them in the chat function on YouTube or Facebook. So let me start now with a question. I'm going to kind of ask the same question to all of you, and I'll start with you, Albert, and that is, as I said in the opening, 2022 was supposed to be the year towards recovery, yet there are some serious setbacks this year towards recovery, including the Ukraine-Russia war, including COVID zero policy in China and the lockdowns we're seeing, supply chain disruptions, and other challenges. So from your perspective, how do you, when you think of these challenges, how do you sort through them and where do you come out on this? And just a question for you. It does seem that the Asian Development Bank is a little more positive about economic growth and trade trends in the region as well than the IMF. And so I'd welcome your comments on that as well. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Wendy. I think the biggest challenge right now is the war and its impact, because it's elevated uncertainty and certainly increased commodity prices, especially energy prices. And because the resolution of how the war will unfold, will it escalate? How will the sanctions unfold, all of those are really a shock to the global system, which is on top of all of the issues related to pandemic recovery. So it's kind of like hitting a man while he's down. It's very hard to withstand that. And it's putting a lot of pressure on the macroeconomic management in many countries around the world, and that includes certainly Asia. Now, Asia is a little bit less affected by the war than other regions of the world, partly because other than Caucasus, Central Asia, and Mongolia, which do have a lot of direct trade, investment, and remittance links to Russia and Ukraine, much of the region really has very little direct trade. Trade from Russia and Ukraine account for only 2.6% of imports into Asia as a whole, 1.6% of exports out of Asia as a whole. And so most of the effects on the region are through the elevated commodity prices. The food price inflation we've seen, which is really creating a very large food insecurity problem globally, is a little bit less pronounced in Asia because the staple grain in Asia is mostly rice, and the price of rice has been relatively stable and not affected by the crisis. Although, again, countries that are more north tend to eat more wheat and are more exposed. And so those are issues. But because many countries in the region have done a fairly good job managing their macroeconomic balances before the pandemic hit, I think they're still able to accommodate the current crises that are coming from the war, but it's challenging. And some countries are less able to. We've seen the crises in Sri Lanka and the political issues in Pakistan, for example, which are related to a lesser ability to cope with the extra shocks. Now, the other thing, as you mentioned, is COVID. COVID still is a huge risk globally. And of course, in Asia, what happens in China is so critical, because we've done some analysis where we find that, what happens in China, if growth in China slows by a percentage point, it translates to lost growth throughout the region because all of the various economic linkages. So let me stop there, and maybe we can continue on some of these topics later.
Okay, so you've basically put the war and the COVID in China and the lockdowns. Maybe I can turn to you, Ted, and maybe you can also answer the question, but from a Southeast Asian perspective. I mean, when Southeast Asian countries look at the global and regional economy now, what concerns them the most? Do you agree with Albert's assessment that maybe they're less concerned about the economic fallout of the war, more concerned about what's going on in China? Over to you.
Thanks, Wendy. I do agree with Albert. And it's not that Southeast Asia is immune from the four challenges that you laid out: the energy disruption, supply chain challenges, inflation, and COVID. It's just that the outlook for Southeast Asia continues to look really strong. So I think that's because of what Albert outlined. There's not as much exposure to Russia or to the effects of wheat prices in Southeast Asia as there might be in other parts of the world. So the ASEAN +3 Macroeconomic Research Office expects ASEAN as a region to grow by over 5% in 2022 and over 5% in 2023. And almost every ASEAN country, especially the Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia, at 6.5% projected growth, for both Philippines and Vietnam, 6% projected growth for Malaysia. Almost every ASEAN country is expected to see greater growth this year. And I think much of this is because the region as a whole is taking the right steps when it comes to dealing with COVID. Many of the countries in the region enjoy very high vaccination rates relative to the rest of the world. Singapore and Vietnam, for example, have vaccinated, in Singapore's case, more than 80% of the population, Vietnam's case, more than 90% of the population. And these high vaccination rates allow most of the Southeast Asian countries to reopen their economies, to safely resume travel and tourism activities, that drives GDP growth and the ability of business people to travel back and forth between the rest of the world and ASEAN. And the digital economy is really vibrant in Southeast Asia. I think it was Bain, Temasek, and Google that put out a report that said the digital economy is expected to increase tenfold by 2030 to $1 trillion for the 10 ASEAN countries. So it's a bit of a rosier outlook than for other parts of the world.
If I can just follow up on what's going on in China, and Albert said, of course, given the connectivity and the supply chain integration between Southeast Asia and China, a slowdown in China or supply chain disruptions in China could impact these numbers and these forecasts in Southeast Asia. Are the Southeast Asian countries very concerned as they're watching the zero COVID policy in China, particularly how it will play out with respect to supply chain disruptions?
Well, they are. The COVID lockdowns in Shanghai and now Beijing could detract from ASEAN's growth. China is ASEAN's largest trade partner, but the region is economically resilient. There's strong domestic consumption. This is a region of almost 700 million people. It's also resilient because of the demographic profile. 60% of the region's population is under the age of 35. The middle class is expected to double in size by 2030 to 350 million people. And the member states of ASEAN enjoy strong relations, not just with China, but also with the United States and with EU. So there's, and a number of ASEAN countries are at the center of a web of preferential trade agreements. So that has increased their global competitiveness there, and it's attracted foreign direct investment. Actually ASEAN is the #1 destination for US foreign direct investment in the Indo-Pacific. The region has attracted $338 billion in US FDI, which is more than the United States has invested in China, India, Japan, and South Korea combined. It's a lot.
That statistic is staggering, right?
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Because we have serious relationships with other parts of Asia, but those investment numbers are really high. And I just think it gives ASEAN options.
Good. Shujiro, over to you. How about Japan? Is Japan as optimistic as Southeast Asia? And what are the challenges facing the Japanese economy now?
While I was listening to Ambassador, very optimistic, I think, outlook of ASEAN, Japan is just the opposite, I'm afraid. To begin with, Japan is a country which is aging, declining population. So potential growth rate is quite low, maybe 1% or so. But Japan at the moment, well, before the war broke out, Japan was recovering, although slowly, from COVID. And then I think we were looking for a much better year for 2022. But because of war, inflation, as we heard, rising prices in energy, food, and Japan depends on imported energy and food quite a bit. And on top of that, we are experiencing a very rapid depreciation of yen, which has a lot to do with the monetary policy of the Bank of Japan. So all of these put together raise the price, and which of course discourage consumption, investment. So according to the IMF projections this year for Japan, in January it was 3.3%, but in April it came down to 2.4%. So I have to say we are looking at a very pessimistic forecast for Japan. Let me just add one more thing. That is the China. You talked about China, and impacts of slowing down with Chinese economy on Japan is quite substantial. I think it goes maybe both ways. When I say both ways, supply and demand side, we export about I think 20% of our exports go to China, and we import about 25% of our imports come from China. Both, manufactured goods. We rely on supply of parts and components coming from China. That's being kind of slowing down, stopped sometimes, and so that really have impacts on production or Japan's production from supply side. And of course, from demand side, our exports to China is not as good as otherwise. In other words, if China keep growing, then we'll benefit a lot. But now China's zero COVID policy has led to, I think, a slowing down the Chinese economy. That has a very negative impact on the Japanese economy. So I kind of hate to say, but we are looking at Japanese economies with a very pessimistic eyes.
Okay, so it's a very different prognosis for Southeast Asia and Japan. Albert, back to you. Let's just delve a little into China then, because obviously the economic growth and trade growth for Southeast Asia and Japan and the rest of Asia is very contingent upon what happens in China. We've seen now, COVID lockdown in Shanghai and other cities. There's, I think, concerns that there may be, an imminent lockdown of Beijing. And all of this is happening in the lead up to the 20th Party Congress this fall. It was reported in the Wall Street Journal that Xi Jinping very much wants to ensure that economic growth in China is greater than US or Western economic growth this year. But also China set a pretty ambitious growth target of around 5.5%. The IMF, I think, lowered their forecast to 4.4% growth for China this year. And some are even speculating that that might even be too optimistic. Where do you come out on this? And also, does Beijing, do they have the policy tools to really spur growth in the coming months in China, through infrastructure spending or other fiscal or monetary tools?
Right. Thank you. China has an ambitious growth target of 5.5%, but most forecasts now are well below 5%. Our ADB's forecast, which was released earlier in April, was for 5% growth this year, but this was really before all of the lockdowns in Shanghai and Shenzhen. So based on data, at least, that was before that. And so I think we would also be probably downgrading our forecast. So, whether it's 4.8, 4.4, I think everyone sees that growth is slowing in China this year. And, the government has some difficult choices. It's pursuing the zero COVID policy, which, of course, was key in allowing China to really avoid negative growth at the beginning of the pandemic. They were one of the only countries in the world to achieve positive growth in 2020. And they had pretty good growth last year. So the difficulty, of course, is that if they have a difficulty controlling the spread of the virus into just these two cities, Shanghai, Beijing, and it goes to many cities in China, and they keep trying to clamp down on economic activity, it's going to be a huge negative effect on the Chinese economy and the regional economy. Now, whether they will choose to do that, of course, remains to be seen. Obviously, when the trade-offs become more acute, maybe they'll move away from the zero COVID policy. I think if you look at international experience, especially as was mentioned by the ambassador in other countries in Asia, one thing that Asian countries have done pretty well is by getting vaccination rates up, they were able to not clamp down so much on economic activity and mobility when Omicron hit earlier this year. And so the economic impacts of Omicron were much less pronounced than in earlier periods of the pandemic. At the same time, it's a political year. So I think it's much more likely that the Chinese leadership will want to be very conservative in really having a very keeping the zero COVID policy. So, how that plays out creates just is unclear and uncertain, and just is an uncertainty that everyone's going to have to kind of bear with. Now, we've already seen the cost of the lockdowns in Shanghai and Shenzhen. In particular, service activity has really dropped off sharply. The services PMI in March was 42 compared to 50 in February. Without getting into what that means, I mean, it's a huge drop, a drop similar to at the very beginning of the pandemic. And it's a drop completely unanticipated, I think, and one which also led China not to meet its growth target in 2020 when the pandemic started. And you're right that the government, because it is a political year, will also want to bolster the economy in ways that it can. It could through monetary policy, fiscal policy, infrastructure spending. But the one thing that the government can't control is the consumer and their spending. And we've seen that consumers are really now are stepping back. Spending is down, service activity is down, and in an environment of lockdowns and uncertainties, that may be hard to recover quickly. So it just may be that China will need to just struggle through this year at a slower growth rate, and of course that will have implications for the rest of the region.
Yeah. Although I would, when you look at the US lockdowns, gosh, our demand for goods just soared during COVID. Services took a hit, but I'm just struck by how Chinese exports to the United States, even with high tariffs affecting, over $300 billion worth of imports, just skyrocketed during COVID. But you're right. I mean, consumer demand is really key in moving things forward. Can you just comment a little more on infrastructure spending? Because that's kind of like the old playbook for China. And some are speculating that it's more difficult now to kind of, pump up the economy through infrastructure spending, given the COVID lockdowns, given the, the supply chain disruptions, and given that they've already built a lot already.
Right. I also like to point out first that in terms of using export, export performance, of course, was great from China because of the demand for goods in the rest of the world. That has kind of mitigated over the last year. And now, because of the war, we're going to see really depressed economies in Europe and maybe even the US. And so that you could have reduced demand, which is going to affect not just China, but obviously other exporting countries in the region. Now, I think China, in terms of infrastructure spending, to their credit, I think they've been unwilling to repeat past cyclical episodes where they just lend a ton of money to infrastructure to try to stimulate the economy. They've been much more modest in those types of responses in this pandemic because they realized when they did that previously, it fueled a lot of speculative price increases in the capital market, in the stock market, and in real estate. And a lot of the funds were not used very efficiently because whenever you throw so much money in a short period of time, it's not sure where it will ultimately land. And so they want to make growth more sustainable. So I think they're much more cautious now in the last 5 years or so in doing that to stimulate the economy. So I think they'll probably approach it in a balanced way. I mean, there are certain things that they may try to allow to be a bit more expensive, the real estate sector, some infrastructure, but I don't think we're going to see a time where they're going to just throw caution to the wind and in a bid to meet some growth target, go crazy. That's my own view. I think that's really consistent with what we've seen recently. So I think the most likely scenario is they're just going to muddle through this year and try to balance these different things, and really how bad it is or how good it is really depends on their ability to control the virus and avoid very costly lockdowns.
Ted, maybe I can ask you if we can just maybe turn to what's going on in supply chains in the region. And, there is a movement of shifting supply chains. Some companies, as they're looking to expand their investments or look for new investments, they're looking beyond China due to geopolitical risk, due to the tariffs, due to just a lot of uncertainties. And so maybe you can just share with us how are the ASEAN countries faring in attracting this investment? I mean, everyone points to Vietnam, but which other countries in the region are attracting the investment? And how important is it for, let's just say, the US business community when they look to invest, to look at the kind of investment facilitation measures that these governments are putting into place to attract these investments? And, what factors or US companies do they look at when they decide, should we move our supply chains? Or if we're not going to move existing investments, when we look to make new investments, where should we be looking?
So I faced this when I was in the private sector, and I advised the company I worked for at the time that Southeast Asia was a good place to boost production, and it was a good idea to diversify. And yes, Vietnam is at the top of many lists, and it was certainly at the top of the list that I was providing to my company. But it's not just Vietnam. ASEAN as a whole has emerged as globally competitive, an alternative to China for a lot of production and even for services. But you mentioned the incentives. Many ASEAN countries, including Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, have rolled out the red carpet. When I met with them when I was in the private sector, there were dedicated agencies. There were tax incentives. There were all kinds of encouragements to adjust supply chain operations and sourcing. But I think in addition to cost, availability of skilled workers, quality of local suppliers, companies are also looking at how governments work with the private sector in the face of all these shocks that we've been discussing. And so that ability to roll out the red carpet and to show an interest in attracting FDI is a competitive advantage. And I think ASEAN countries are realizing that they have to compete with each other in order to show the most attractive environment possible. And I've heard it directly from some that say, yeah, we're competing with Vietnam. We're trying to show that we're an even better place to bring production than Vietnam, because Vietnam now is America's 10th largest trading partner. It has shown a lot of advantages to companies, and other ASEAN countries are taking notice.
Can you just comment for a minute about how the ASEAN countries have been coping with COVID? I know early on, Singapore, which was kind of a hub for a lot of foreign companies, was viewed as, their very restrictive COVID policies kind of led to an outcry by the business community. Now, if I'm correct, Singapore has just said, we're open, and no, we don't even need to check anything at the border. Is that really what's going on? And is that going on in the rest of ASEAN now? Are they kind of putting COVID behind them?
Pretty much. We're actually, we had a business mission in Vietnam because Vietnam had opened up and made it possible to bring businesses into the country and meet in real time. And we're leading now in-person business missions to Cambodia and Singapore, and later in the year to Indonesia. I'm bringing the board of the US ASEAN Business Council to Singapore because the measures have shifted so much, and you now can gather in larger groups, and the kind of draconian policies that I think were in place before with regard to testing and quarantine aren't there. And that's not completely consistent across ASEAN, but the trend is really clear. It's getting easier and easier and easier to travel within ASEAN.
Mm-hmm. So Urata-san, maybe then I can turn to you. After China, Japan still has some of the most restrictive COVID policies in terms of foreigners, being able to visit Japan. Do you see that those restrictions relaxing over time? I know that the U.S. business community in particular has been, somewhat critical of Japan's policies there. And how is Japan dealing with COVID now?
I think we began relaxing our restrictions already, maybe a couple of weeks ago. Now, if you're coming from the U.S., with the maybe and if you have a kind of a certificate or something showing that you have 3 vaccinations, you don't have to really, stay at the airport or a hotel. So we are relaxing restrictions. And at the same time, a lot of Japanese business people are now traveling to ASEAN countries, as we heard from Ambassador. I know my friends working for the companies or even like academics, they start going to Thailand, Vietnam. Indonesia is somewhat maybe a little different because they still have some many cases of COVID cases. But again, businesses between Japan and ASEAN have begun to grow again, I think. And as Japanese local market is not, as I told you, growing as much as we like to see it grow. So many Japanese companies are investing very actively in foreign countries, especially ASEAN, but they are not really leaving China to join ASEAN, but they have like a two strong kind of policy. One, they like to, of course, focus on China, which is a big market, but we see ASEAN as a possible market as well as a base for kind of export production. So a lot of companies are doing very actively investment, very actively in China and ASEAN and even India. So that's what's happening. Again, as COVID situation is getting more kind of settling down, businesses have started moving, I think, very actively.
I know there are a lot of business ties between Japanese business folks and India. And we have a question from the audience because no one's really mentioned India yet. How does India fit into this picture? Is this one of the countries where you see a lot more of travel activity between the two business sectors? And how do you, when you look at prospects for trade with India, are you bullish? I mean, India has just been embarking on some new trade agreements. They just announced an interim trade deal with Australia. They concluded an FTA with the UAE, and they're negotiating with the UK and the EU. How do you view all this?
Right. Well, according to survey done by Bank for International Cooperation, Japanese Bank for International Cooperation, India ranked second after China as a promising investment destination. And it's been like that for many years. Of course, we know India has a big population. They were growing quite well, I think, until this COVID hit them. So potentially, anyway, India is very promising, very attractive market. And that's how Japanese businesses are looking at India. Having said this, Japanese government and businesses were very disappointed when India left the negotiation, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP negotiation, at the final stage of negotiation. The Japanese wanted India to be in RCEP agreement, but for various reasons, maybe we don't have much time to discuss the reason, but India, withdrew from that. And I think that was a very disappointing event for Japanese businesses.
Albert, maybe then I can turn to you, because the ADB, you've done a lot of work on just, very on regional economic integration and how these trade agreements, particularly RCEP, is really promoting more supply chain connectivity and economic integration among Asian countries. How do you see that playing out looking to the future? Is that a trend we're going to see solidify in the coming months and years?
Before I get to this question, maybe I just say one word about India, and that is that, our growth projection, and not just ours, the IMF's as well, is very optimistic for India this year, growth over 7%. And
it's from a low base, though, from last year.
That's on recovering demand in India. But the thing about India in terms of its regional integration with the rest of Asia is that it has chosen not to join both the CPTPP or the RCEP, so that will limit, to some extent, its opportunities vis-a-vis Asia. Now, as you discussed, they are reaching out to other trade partners in the West and Australia. The ADB each year publishes a report on Asian economic integration. And what we've seen, including our most recent report, is a very steady increase in regional economic integration among countries in the region, and even within sub-regions in Asia. And I think that's really driven by a consistent commitment to open trade and investment, which has, underlined dynamism in the Asia region for decades. And it's not just RCEP, ASEAN has signed a number of different regional, not just ASEAN, but countries and regions have signed a number of regional and bilateral trade agreements. And we're seeing the fruits of that to some extent. And as the ambassador noted as well, we've not only seen export growth in Asia well beyond the global performance, but the digital services trade in particular has been extremely dynamic in the region. It's developing very fast and increasing connectivity. We've also seen, the other thing worth pointing out is that China has played a key role in this as well, because China's growth in trade and investment has been accompanied with tighter integration in the region. But more generally, we've seen just a development within the region in global value chains. So regional global value chains have really been developing fast. As was described just a second ago, Japanese companies are now making their supply chains increasingly outsourced to countries in Southeast Asia. Auto companies have been doing that for a while, but also now electronics companies like Samsung are now deeply investing in the global supply chains around the region. RCEP plays a role, but RCEP was just signed, at the beginning of this year. So
it went into effect the beginning of this year.
The beginning of this year. Sorry, not signed. And so I think we'll just have to see how it plays out. What's nice about RCEP is that in theory, it should really even further accelerate this global value chain, but it should make it easier for companies to create kind of richer patterns of supply chains among countries in the region. And I think that should also create more opportunities for the poorer countries in the region to find a niche in these value chains. It may be hard to be competitive for sophisticated final products, but if it's a small process at the early part of at the end of the supply chain, it might make some sense. So I think it's promising. RCEP also there's still a lot of implementation issues for RCEP and things that are continuing to be discussed and fleshed out. But I think it's very promising to continue helping Asia keep moving in this direction.
All right, Ted, where is the United States in all this? Obviously, we're not a member of RCEP, and we never sought to be members, but we were at one time a member of TPP, and then we decided to leave. Now the administration is on the cusp of announcing a new Indo-Pacific economic framework. And I'd be curious on what you're hearing from your ASEAN counterparts on this new initiative. I mean, on one hand, I think many countries in Asia, including in ASEAN, are very welcoming for a US economic presence and kind of stepping up our economic engagement in the region. On the other hand, we do hear concerns that ASEAN countries don't really understand this initiative and can't identify what's in it for them. But maybe you can share with us what you're hearing and what your views are on this initiative.
Thank you. First, I find myself in, once again, violent agreement with Albert.
Well, he agreed with you, so you're allowed to.
I know it's better if we fight during a discussion like this, but we're not. I agree with him. RCEP, CPTPP, other preferential trade agreements have created flexibility for both the country members and the companies that are involved in production in the region. So it's, of course, like you, I worked on TPP. I wish we were in TPP. I wish we'd gone ahead with that particular arrangement, but we didn't. And so now the administration, working within really tight political constraints, has come up with something that I think is pretty creative. And it puts America back at the drawing table, at the rulemaking table on some really key issues, like what are the rules of the road for digital trade, and puts us, I think, at the center of the discussion on supply chains and supply chain resilience. So what I'm hearing is a lot of interest on the part of ASEAN countries, clear interest on the part of Singapore, for example, and then muted interest on the part of a number of ASEAN countries. I don't know that they're all signed up yet, but we're hearing movement, which I think is in the right direction. In my view, this isn't just about the components of the agreement, but it's also about the signaling that if you're an ASEAN country and you say, well, we're putting our hands up, we want to have these discussions with the United States, that signals to investors, okay, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, Vietnam are in it, and they're going to engage. They don't know exactly what the outcome will be, but it's a good sign to investors to be in and not outside when this process launches. So I know that there are those out there who wish that IPEF included market access provisions. At this time, it doesn't. I do think it is a process that we need to get going so that we can see how ambitious it can become in the process of carrying it out. So muted enthusiasm. I'd like to see more enthusiasm. The president's special summit that he'll host in mid-May may be yet another opportunity to gin up enthusiasm for what's in IPEF.
Yeah, I would agree with what you said. If anyone from the administration is watching, I would just say the sooner you roll it out, the better.
Yes.
It's just been too long. And I think the longer people don't know the details, the more criticism it's getting, which, isn't fair, but there's a vacuum of detail. Urata-san, over to you. Japan's been very vocal about wanting to get the US back to CPTPP.
Yes.
Again, I think Ted, summed it up. Many of us on this webinar would like to see it, but it's not going to happen. We're going forward with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which will have a trade component, but it's not going to be a traditional trade agreement. Japan has been very supportive of this initiative. And so at least the government has. And so let me ask you, Urata-san, how do you view this initiative? You've been around the trade world for a long time. Do you think we can really do something different than a traditional trade agreement, particularly an agreement without market access?
Right. Well, it's a, I think, welcoming development from the point of Asia and Japan. So meaning the Japanese government and of course Japanese businesses, they support this U.S. Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Having said this, I don't think this is a binding kind of agreement like CPTPP. And for countries to participate in like a framework, they like to have some incentives. Incentives can be, market access to the U.S. market. That is a very important and big incentive for any countries to sign up trade agreement with the United States. And that's what the CPTPP is all about. So like Wendy said, I think we, Japanese government and businesses, they keep kind of asking or requesting or demanding US to come back to CPTPP. And another reason for maybe US, for the US should come back to CPTPP is, if I understand correctly, this is a framework, TPP was a framework, which the US led the discussions, negotiations. Part of the reason is to deal with China. We wanted to see China to abide by trade rules because they do have problem with so-called like unfair trade practices and so on. But if we are successful in getting China into this agreement like CPTPP, they have to abide by these rules, and that will give the businesses level playing field, so to speak, to do their business. So again, if I know U.S. is eager to see China to abide by the rules, then CPTPP is one such framework. And as you know, China has applied to join CPTPP, but why can't the US try the same thing? And then maybe the US can use CPTPP to make China perform as best, by performing that, I mean, abide by trade rules. So this is one of the reasons that Japan wants US to come back. But there are other reasons too, because as we know, WTO is not really doing a good job of liberalizing trade or setting trade rules. And under such circumstances, CPTPP or maybe RCEP, these FTAs can play a very important role. And for this, we'd like US to join this effort in setting up FTAs to deal with a problem with the WTO. So there are some of the reasons like that. And that's why Japan is really asking US to come back.
So Albert, how do you view China's application to join CPTPP? Do you think they're serious and they're really prepared to make the types of changes they need to make with respect to IPR and digital and labor and state-owned enterprises? Or is this just something that they want to put their hat in the ring and, just launch a negotiation and see where it leads to?
Well, I think China is committed to being part of regional trade arrangements. I think obviously with the sanctions against them by the US, they feel it's important for them to stay connected with as many countries in the world as they can. And of course, Asia is their natural, regional trade integration partners. Now, whether they're prepared to make all of the commitments that would be necessary, I'm sure their view is that they would like to do that in good faith, but I'm sure they'll negotiate hard about how all of these things are interpreted. And so, how that plays out and how long it would take for them to negotiate things in a way that they would feel comfortable with, I think remains to be seen. But I certainly think the intent is genuine. It's strongly in their interest to be part of all of the major trade arrangements in the region. I also want to say something about the U.S. initiative. I think this welcome, because I think U.S. economic integration and presence in the region should be beneficial to countries in the region if there's really constructive engagement. And I do think that the nature of trade and investment is changing so fast with technology. And so, the digital area in particular, there's so many issues related to regulation, taxation, information, security that need to be, better understood and agreed upon to promote the healthy development of trade in these sectors that I think the U.S. Really can help push those dialogues along based on their experience and expertise. And I think Japan, too, has an important role to play in the region, leading these efforts as the country that's really done the most so far. So I think that's all beneficial. But one thing I also wanted to point out in terms of the limitations of the new initiative is that because it's not a trade agreement that's ratified by Congress, I think many countries in the region may be worried that if the administration changes in the U.S., then it could be gone in a flash, right? So in terms of making binding commitments to some of these things, that's an issue too in terms of creating credible incentives. So hopefully there'll be ways to make credible commitments.
Yeah, I think you've identified an important challenge, and that it's on the administration to kind of demonstrate the durability of this initiative and that it will continue, particularly for asking other countries to do things that maybe they don't really want to do. One topic I just want to get at before we close this webinar is the issue of income inequality. And that has been a prevalent issue in the United States when, folks look at globalization, that globalization's kind of exacerbated income inequality, but it's not unique to the United States. Prime Minister Kishida in Japan has talked about this new model of capitalism with new policies. I know in ASEAN area, when you look at surveys of what are the major concerns among ASEAN citizens, one of them towards the top is income equality and a sense that not only globalization contributed to this, but COVID did as well. So I would just be interested in all three of you just commenting on the issue of income inequality. Is this really serious? And are there specific policy measures that can be followed, either pursued collectively or individually, to address some of what I consider to be, real concerns? Albert, you're on the screen now, so I'm going to ask you to go first.
Right. Sure. I think inequality is a huge issue in the region, and the pandemic, probably even more than in the West, exacerbated inequality because you had digital divides. I mean, just one area we focus on in our recent outlook report is the school closures really were extended in many Asian countries, and it led to learning loss by many children, and especially poor children who had no digital connectivity when schools were closed. They just fell way behind. And so that's an example, but the labor market as well, the informal sector, the less educated, women, all fared much more poorly during the pandemic, exacerbating, existing inequalities and making it much worse. So the challenge, I think, for governments, there's one, of course, is the digital divide itself, because digital technology is obviously key for growth and development and has really flourished and accelerated during the pandemic, but it needs to be accessible to everybody if it's not going to exacerbate rather than reduce inequality. And there are ways in which it can increase opportunities for small businesses who can do new things in digital, or for farmers who can get better information and trade more. So it's not one necessary outcome, but it really depends on thoughtful investments and efforts to make digital development as inclusive as possible. The other thing that happened during the pandemic was there was really an effort to improve social protection systems to reach out to vulnerable groups that had not been that well targeted in the past, especially the informal sector. And I think those are positive lessons. And obviously, governments need the fiscal space to be able to continue protecting the vulnerable. And given that many countries are in deficit or have debt levels, they need to be even better at targeting to keep protecting the vulnerable. And then, of course, in the long run, and related to digital development, is that investments in skills are going to be key for the future in terms of putting as many people, young people, in a position to be able to get good paying jobs in the future.
Ed, over to you.
Just as a measure of how serious governments are taking it, if you listen to what Singaporean leaders are talking about, they're constantly talking about inclusiveness and the importance of addressing income inequalities. And this is Singapore, the land of free trade. The other aspect, Albert mentioned the digital divide, and I think a lot of nations in the region and companies in the region, including our member companies, are very serious about providing digital literacy and helping ensure that even marginalized groups have access to learning about how to benefit from being connected on the internet. Google, through the Asia Foundation, has a program that reaches all 10 ASEAN countries, and specifically marginalized group. Our council runs an SME academy to make sure that digital skills are accessible free to SMEs across the region, and tens of thousands of SMEs take advantage of that. And then we put out a report called Bouncing Forward from COVID-19 about how to make sure that recovery is as inclusive as possible. And we focused a lot on access to healthcare because that is really critical to make sure that financing for healthcare is structured in a way that the women and children of the region have access to the healthcare that they need, so that women in particular can be part of the recovery and be able to contribute to the recovery. You can't do that if they don't have access to, if they and their families don't have access to healthcare. So those are two of the many elements that we look at in bouncing forward from COVID-19.
Great points. Urata-san, you have the last word then. I think many folks are surprised that even Japan is experiencing concerns with income inequality, which has led Prime Minister Kishida to announce this new, his new form of capitalism policies. How do you interpret, what he plans to do in this area? And is Japan moving forward on trying to narrow the digital divide?
Yeah, well, he still, I think he's in the process of kind of defining or maybe formulating policies to deal with this increasing income equality. Of course, he'd like to achieve economic growth and equal distribution of income simultaneously. And according to his kind of policy or theory, if you get the equal distribution of income, that will lead to increasing consumption, that will in turn increase GDP or income, and then the income growth will lead to equal distribution of income. So that's a kind of framework that he has, and the measures that he has taken so far is to provide this government support to underprivileged people and so on. At the same time, one of the interesting measures is to really persuade big business to increase wages for their workers. And I'm not quite sure how effective that there will be. I'm kind of doubtful about this asking businesses to increase their employees' wages. And the problem in Japan is that the labor productivity of Japanese workers is quite low now. We used to have quite high labor productivity, but now it is quite low according to like OECD estimates. We are one of those in the very bottom of the scale. And in my view, the problem is the Japanese government is trying to help companies to survive. Companies facing with this problem with the COVID, the government provides subsidies to the companies to survive, to continue their business. In my view, the better policy is to provide subsidy or some kind of assistance to workers directly rather than to companies. And what happened is because companies, even if they are inefficient, unproductive, they can survive thanks to government, help. And in Japan, I think it is a company, this is an economy where a very little turnaround, like a very small number of entry, small number of exits of the companies. That is, I think, a basis of problem. So what we need, in my view, is for the government to focus on their kind of assistance given to individuals, workers, rather than companies, and let inefficient companies to exit from the industry. And that, I think, is what we need. But I don't think it is very difficult for us to see that happen because of maybe political pressure. But I think that's a basic problem that Japan is faced with.
Well, with that, I'm going to bring this webinar to a close. Thank you, Albert. Thank you, Urata-san. Thank you, Ted. This has been a great discussion. We put a lot of issues on the table. I think we can continue discussing these. It's a conversation it's not over, and it's going to be a very dynamic and fluid, year as economies try to recover from COVID and kind of reshape their economic futures. So thank you very much. And for the Asia Society, we welcome you back to our platform for our upcoming programs. Everyone have a good day or good evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.